Some nights never leave you. For me, it was the week before Christmas, the machines humming beside my wife's bed, while snow kept falling outside. I thought family meant gathering close. When life turned fragile, but instead my son was 2 hours away, lifting a glass of champagne at his wife's birthday party. I stayed quiet, then holding Margaret's hand. But silence has a breaking point. What he asked of me the very next day forced a choice that none of us could ever take back. I sat by the hospital bed and listened to the machines hum in the dim light of the intensive care unit. The green lines on the monitor crawled up and down, each beep a reminder of how fragile Margaret's breaths had become. Her hand was so light in mine, as if all the strength that once carried our family had slipped away. I rubbed her fingers slowly, pretending the warmth from my palm could hold her here just a little longer. The room smelled of disinfectant, and outside the door I could hear the squeak of nurses' shoes on the tile floor. It was Christmas week in Columbus, Ohio, and the city outside was wrapped in lights and music. But in here, it was all silence, broken only by the sound of machines. I thought about the years behind us, the small home we built on the east side of town, the long days she spent teaching children their first letters. The evenings we sat together at the kitchen table, paying bills and talking about the future. I tried to speak softly, not to startle her. "You're not alone, Maggie. I'm right here." Her eyelids twitched, maybe just the rhythm of the machines, maybe something more. I wanted to believe she heard me. My phone buzzed on the chair beside me. I almost ignored it, but the glow of the screen caught my eye. A message from one of Daniel's friends, a short video. My thumb hovered before I pressed play. The sound of laughter and clinking glasses filled the sterile hospital room. There was my son standing in the middle of a restaurant in downtown Cleveland, his arm around Olivia's shoulders, a sparkling glass raised high. Everyone shouted happy birthday. I froze, the contrast cutting straight through me. Here I was watching my wife fight for every breath, and my son was 2 hours away, smiling as if the world belonged to him. He shouted over the noise, saying, "Family is everything." The crowd cheered and Olivia kissed his cheek. I let the phone drop into my lap, my chest aching. A nurse came in to check the IV line, glanced at me, and paused. "Mr. Coleman, do you need anything?" I shook my head quickly, not wanting her to see the tears burning my eyes. She gave me a kind look and walked out. I leaned forward close to Margaret's ear. "Our boy should be here, Maggie. He should be holding your hand instead of a glass of champagne." I swallowed hard and pressed my forehead against her shoulder. Memories came in waves. The first time I saw her in a yellow summer dress back in 1976. The day I came home from the Navy, and she ran across the train platform straight into my arms. The long years when I delivered mail through snow and rain while she kept the house warm. We carried each other through everything. Now I was carrying her into the final hours, and I was afraid I was not strong enough. The phone buzzed again. Another clip, another cheer. I turned it face down, unable to look. My jaw tightened. I thought about the vows I had once taken in uniform, the promise to serve with honor. I had kept that promise to my country. I had kept every promise to my wife. But my own son, the boy we raised with every ounce of sacrifice we had, was not here when she needed him most. The beeping of the monitor slowed for a moment, then steadied again. I squeezed her hand. "Stay with me, Maggie, just a little longer." Outside the window, the city lights blurred in the falling snow. I imagined the streets full of people rushing to last-minute shopping, kids pressing their faces against frosted glass to see toys, couples walking arm in arm under the glow of holiday decorations. Life went on outside while mine was narrowing to the space of this single room. I stood to stretch my back joints stiff from hours in the chair. The hallway was quiet, most of the hospital subdued by the season. I looked back at her and felt the weight of years pressing on me. I wanted Daniel to walk through that door. I wanted him to see what mattered. Instead, silence. Only Margaret's fragile breath, only my own shadow on the wall. I sat back down and held her hand again, the memory of that video still burning behind my eyes. The machines kept their steady rhythm, but every beat felt like a drum in my chest. I rubbed Margaret's hand, with both of mine, whispering her name under my breath, as if saying it enough times might keep her anchored here. The night dragged on a blur of shadows across the floor, and the faint hum of the heating vents pushing out stale air. At some point I stood and walked toward the small window. From the 7th floor, I could see the parking lot below empty except for a few scattered cars dusted with snow. Streetlights painted halos on the asphalt. Beyond that, the city stretched out alive and moving. Somewhere in Cleveland, my son was still smiling under a cascade of candles and laughter. I closed my eyes and remembered a different night long ago when I was 20 years old, standing on the deck of a Navy ship, salt wind cutting my face, the ocean black and endless. We had been ordered to stay alert, and I had gripped the railing so tight my knuckles cracked. That same resolve had carried me through storms, through long nights of mail delivery, when the snow was waist-high, through the years when money was scarce. But Margaret's smile made everything bearable. I had lived my life by the belief that duty came first. Now I felt betrayed that my own son had never learned that lesson. The sound of the monitor shifted slightly and pulled me back. I hurried to her side. Her eyelids trembled, and I leaned down close. "I am here, Maggie. I am right here." She did not speak, but her lips moved faintly as if trying to form a word. I pressed her hand against my cheek, desperate to believe she was trying to answer me. My phone vibrated again. Against my better judgment, I picked it up. Another video, this time Olivia's voice loud and clear. She laughed, telling a friend next to her that once the old man signed the papers, they could finally move on. The words hit me like cold steel. They were not even waiting. They were planning as my wife lay here fighting for her last breaths. I shut the phone off and slipped it into my pocket. My chest tightened, and I had to take a deep breath to keep from crying out loud. My eyes burned not just with sorrow, but with something hotter, something sharper. A nurse came in with a clipboard. She checked the fluids, wrote down a few numbers, and glanced at me. "Mr. Coleman, you should try to rest." I shook my head. "I cannot leave her." She gave me a look of understanding, squeezed my shoulder gently, and left without another word. The hours crawled. I thought about the times Margaret stayed up late sewing patches on Daniel's jeans because we could not afford new ones. I remembered how she kept a jar in the kitchen where she saved every coin for his college textbooks. All those nights when she waited up for me to return from the post office, a warm plate covered with foil waiting on the stove. Our lives were built on sacrifice. And Daniel, the boy we had given everything to, had chosen champagne over his mother's last night. I leaned forward and brushed a strand of hair from Margaret's forehead. Her skin was pale, almost translucent under the hospital light. I whispered again, "I will not let them dishonor you. Not while I still breathe." Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang, muffled by distance. Footsteps echoed, then faded. The hospital had settled into that strange quiet of the early morning when time felt suspended. My back ached from the chair, but I did not care. My world had narrowed to this room and the weight of my promise. I glanced once more at the window. Snow was falling harder now, flakes drifting through the yellow glow of the streetlights. I imagined Cleveland's streets slick with ice, Daniel and Olivia climbing into a cab, laughter spilling into the cold air. They had no idea how quickly joy could turn to grief, how fragile life truly was. I bent over and kissed Margaret's forehead, closing my eyes for a moment. I tried to picture her strong again, her voice warm, the way she used to call me in from the porch when supper was ready. But the beeping beside me pulled me back, steady but fragile, each sound a reminder of how little time remained. I stayed there, her hand in mine, my thoughts circling between memories of our life together and the bitterness of that video. And as the night deepened, the line between sorrow and anger grew thinner until I could barely tell one from the other. The monitor let out a sound that cut through the haze of my half-sleep and jolted me upright. I leaned over the bed, heart pounding. Margaret's chest rose in shallow, uneven pulls, her face pale as porcelain. I pressed the call button and shouted for help. A nurse rushed in, followed by another, their voices clipped and urgent. One adjusted the oxygen mask, the other checked the IV. I clutched her hand and whispered her name again and again, desperate to hold her here. Her eyes fluttered open for just a second, and I thought I saw the faintest trace of recognition. My throat closed up. I bent close, telling her I loved her, telling her to fight if she could. But the sound of the machines changed the beeps, stretching farther apart. The nurse called out a number to her colleague, then pressed her lips together. More staff hurried in, a doctor among them. They moved around me, their bodies forming a wall of scrubs and gloves. I stepped back, my hands trembling. The doctor tried, he really did, giving orders, pressing down on her chest. But I could see it in his eyes, even before he turned to me. I shook my head, backing away from the truth that was already sinking into my bones. The doctor spoke softly, his voice a blur over the ringing in my ears. "Time of death," he said. Then the rest was lost, in the buzzing roar inside my head. I stumbled back to the chair, covering my face with both hands. The room spun, and I fought for breath, the grief crashing over me like a tide. My wife. The girl I met in a yellow dress on a summer afternoon. The woman who waded through deployments, who raised our children with strength and patience, was gone. The nurses left quietly, one of them placing a hand on my shoulder before slipping out the door. The doctor gave me a moment, then followed. The room was still again, but it felt heavier than ever. I dragged myself up and leaned over the bed, pressing my lips to her forehead, already cooling. "Goodbye, Maggie. You gave me everything, and I could not give you this one thing, a proper farewell with your children by your side." I wiped my eyes, reached for my phone, and dialed Daniel. The call rang and rang before going to voicemail. I called again and again, but each time the same hollow recording played. I clenched the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. Finally, I dropped it into my lap and stared at the floor. I thought of Emily and knew she needed to hear it from me, not anyone else. My fingers shook as I scrolled to her name. She answered on the second ring, her voice already tight, as if she sensed the weight in mine. "Dad, what happened?" I forced the words out, broken and raw. "She's gone, sweetheart. Your mother's gone." A gasp, then a sob that pierced through the line. I told her I was still at the hospital, that she should come. She said she would be there as soon as she could. I hung up and sat back, the silence pressing in. The snow outside kept falling flakes, catching the orange glow of the streetlights, and I thought of how Margaret used to love the first snow of the year. She would wrap herself in a scarf and call me to the window, her eyes lit up like a child's. I sat there with that memory holding it, like a fragile ornament that might shatter in my hands. Emily arrived an hour later, her coat half buttoned, her hair damp from the snow. She rushed to me, eyes red, and we fell into each other's arms. She cried against my chest, her body shaking, and I held her as tightly as I could. We stood like that for a long time, two pieces of a broken whole. She pulled away, finally wiping her cheeks. "Where's Daniel?" Her voice was small, almost hopeful. I looked at her, unable to answer right away. "He is not here," I said at last. "He never came." Her face crumpled, a mix of sorrow and anger. She whispered that she should not be surprised. Together we walked back to Margaret's bedside. Emily touched her mother's hand, stroked her hair, whispered words only she and her mother could share. Watching her broke me all over again. Yet I felt a strange kind of pride, too. She had always carried Margaret's strength inside her. A nurse returned quietly with paperwork explaining gently what needed to be signed. Emily stayed close, her hand steadying mine as I scrawled my name. My vision blurred, the ink smearing a little. Later, as we stepped out into the cold night, the snow had thickened, blanketing the cars and the sidewalks. Emily looped her arm through mine, guiding me like I was the one who needed care. The world outside moved on. Cars passing, lights flickering in store windows, people rushing home. But for us, time had stopped. We reached her car, and she opened the door for me. I sank into the seat, staring straight ahead, numb. She slid in beside me, started the engine, and sat in silence for a moment. "Dad," she said softly, "we will take care of her. We will do right by her." I nodded, but the words caught in my throat. The drive back was quiet except for the sound of tires crunching on snow. Houses along the way glowed with Christmas lights, families gathering inside. I wondered if Daniel and Olivia were still celebrating, if they had even noticed the missed calls. The thought cut deep, but I shoved it aside. There would be time for that later. For now, the only thing I could do was hold on to Emily's words and the memory of Margaret's hand in mine, as the night carried us farther from the hospital and closer to the life I would have to face without her. Emily pulled into my driveway, and the porch light flickered on with the motion sensor. The house looked the same from the outside, snow piling on the steps. But when I opened the front door, the silence felt different. The air carried the weight of absence. Margaret's slippers were still by the rug, her reading glasses on the table beside her chair. I stood there, unable to move, while Emily quietly hung our coats. She guided me to the kitchen and put on a pot of coffee, even though it was well past midnight. We sat at the table where Margaret and I had shared thousands of meals, the wood worn smooth by years of elbows and plates and conversation. Emily reached across and held my hand. "Dad, we will make this right. Mom deserves the best." I nodded, though the lump in my throat kept me from speaking. The following morning was a blur of phone calls and arrangements. Emily handled most of it, her voice steady, even when I could hear the tears pressing at the edges. Jacob joined us later, carrying folders and a small laptop. He spoke with the funeral home, coordinated with the church, checked details with the cemetery. I watched them work together and thought of how proud Margaret would have been to see her daughter so strong. By late afternoon, the doorbell rang. When I opened it, Daniel stood there, his coat unbuttoned, his expression casual, as if he were dropping by after a business meeting. Olivia trailed behind him, her perfume entering the house before she did. I expected an embrace or at least some words of comfort, but instead, Daniel brushed snow from his sleeves and asked how the plans were going. Emily froze where she stood. "Mom is gone," she said, her voice trembling. Daniel looked at her, then at me, and gave a short nod. "I know. That is why I am here now." His tone was clipped, practical, not grieving. We moved into the living room. Margaret's photo sat on the mantel, surrounded by candles Emily had lit. The glow reflected in the glass of the frame. Daniel glanced at it briefly before turning back to me. "Have you considered the costs? Dad, funerals can be outrageously expensive." My jaw tightened. I wanted words of sorrow, not numbers. Emily spoke before I could. "This is our mother's farewell. It is not the time to cut corners." Daniel shook his head. She would not have wanted a fuss. Simple and efficient, that is what she would prefer. Olivia added softly, "Almost everyone chooses the budget package now. No reason to waste money." I stared at them both, the coffee in my hand turning bitter on my tongue. Emily's face flushed with anger. "Waste money? You are talking about Mom's life, her memory." Jacob placed a calming hand on her arm, but she pulled away. Daniel leaned against the arm of the sofa, arms crossed, his expression cool. Dad, you need to think about what comes after. There's no sense throwing money into a hole in the ground. The words hung in the air like smoke. I stood slowly, every muscle stiff. Your mother gave her life for this family. She stayed up late sewing, she taught in overcrowded classrooms. She never once thought of herself. If there is any dignity left in this house, it will be in how we say goodbye to her. Daniel opened his mouth to argue again, but I raised my hand. Enough. He looked away, lips pressed tight, but I saw the flicker of annoyance in his eyes. Olivia shifted uncomfortably, adjusting her scarf, avoiding Emily's glare. The evening dragged as we went over details with Jacob. The church service, the music, Margaret loved the burial plot we had chosen years ago together. Emily insisted on fresh flowers, a choir, a proper reception afterward. Daniel rolled his eyes more than once, muttering under his breath. But he stayed quiet when I fixed my gaze on him. When they finally left, Emily collapsed into the chair beside me. I am sorry you had to hear that, Dad. He has changed. I shook my head slowly. Maybe he has been this way longer than we wanted to admit. She leaned against me, her shoulders trembling. That night the house felt even emptier. I wandered into the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. Margaret's pillow still carried the faint scent of her lavender soap. I closed my eyes, pressing the fabric to my face, wishing for the impossible. The echo of Daniel's words about cost and waste circled in my head until sleep finally pulled me under. The days that followed were filled with preparations. Friends and neighbors dropped by with casseroles and condolences. Emily handled visitors with grace. Jacob answered phone calls with firm efficiency. I moved through it all, like a shadow present, but distant. On the third day, Daniel returned. He arrived later than expected, walking into the kitchen while Emily and I were reviewing hymns for the service. He clapped his hands together lightly. So what have we decided? His voice carried no grief, only impatience. Emily's eyes narrowed. We are giving Mom the service she deserves. That means no shortcuts. Daniel smirked. Of course you would say that. Always the sentimental one. He turned to me. Dad, you know I am right. It is just money. I set my coffee cup down and looked him square in the eyes. It is not just money. It is respect. For a moment he held my gaze, then looked away, a shadow of something hard passing across his face. Olivia touched his arm, whispering something I could not hear. He nodded faintly, then forced a smile. Fine, do what you want. But do not come crying to me when the bills pile up. He left soon after the slam of the door, rattling the windows. Emily pressed her hands to her face, whispering that she could not believe her brother had become this man. I put an arm around her and told her the truth as it sat heavy in my chest. Neither can I. The house grew quiet again. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the neighborhood and white muffling every sound. Inside, I felt the weight of two battles at once, one for my wife's memory and another with my own son, who seemed determined to strip that memory away. The knock on the door came early the next morning, sharp and insistent. I opened it to find Daniel standing on the porch snow, still clinging to his shoes. Olivia just behind him, with her arms crossed tight against her coat. Daniel stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, brushing past me, as if the house already belonged to him. He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. Dad, I wanted to come by before things get too busy with the funeral. We need to talk about the future. I motioned them toward the living room, though every part of me wanted them gone. Olivia sat carefully on the edge of the couch, her phone in hand, tapping the screen as if she were half somewhere else. Daniel remained standing, pacing slowly, as though he were preparing to give a presentation. He finally stopped in front of me and said it plainly. I think it is time you let go of the house. Sell it while the market is hot. Olivia and I have been looking at a place in Sarasota. Oceanfront, a great investment. All we need is your signature and it will be done. The words hit like a slap. My house. The place Margaret and I had poured our sweat into the walls that held every Christmas morning, every birthday, every night spent rocking babies to sleep. He spoke of it like a piece of stock to be traded. Emily walked in from the kitchen holding a mug of coffee. She froze when she heard him, her eyes flashing. "Are you out of your mind? Mom has not even been laid to rest." Daniel barely glanced at her. "This is exactly the time to be practical, sis. Dad is not getting any younger, and this house is too much for him." I stood slowly, the weight of years pressing into my back. "I have lived here for more than 30 years. Your mother's laughter still fills these walls. Do you really think I will just sign it away?" Daniel's smile faltered, but he pressed on. "Dad, you always taught me to think ahead, to be smart with money. This is the smart move. You cannot maintain this place forever." Olivia finally looked up from her phone. "Richard, it is just paperwork. We would handle everything. You would not have to worry." Her tone was smooth, practiced, like she had rehearsed it. Emily slammed her mug onto the table so hard the coffee sloshed over the rim. "You are unbelievable. This is not about helping Dad. It is about helping yourselves." Daniel turned on her, his jaw tight. "You never understood responsibility. You always ran from it. That is why you married Jacob, so he could take care of you." Emily's face flushed red, but before she could answer, I raised my hand. "Enough." The room fell quiet. I looked straight at Daniel. "Your mother is barely gone and you stand here with your hand out. That is not responsibility. That is greed." He opened his mouth, closed it again, then let out a short laugh. "Dad, you are being emotional. You will see this is the right thing when the bills start piling up." I stepped closer, close enough to see the small scar on his chin from when he fell off his bike at 10 years old, the scar Margaret had kissed that night to calm his tears. My voice was steady, though my hands trembled. "I will never sign this house away. Not for you, not for anyone." Silence stretched in the room, broken only by the hum of the furnace. Olivia shifted uncomfortably, but Daniel stared back at me, his smile gone, replaced with something harder, colder. Finally, he shrugged and headed for the door. "Think about it, Dad. The offer will not last forever." Olivia followed, giving Emily a tight smirk on her way out. When the door closed, Emily let out a shaky breath and dropped into the chair. "Dad, I cannot believe him." I sat down slowly, the exhaustion sinking into my bones. "Believe it. He is showing us who he really is." We sat in silence for a while, the snow outside falling heavier, the weight of his words still hanging in the air. I thought of Margaret, of the promises I had made, beside her bed. And I knew in that moment that the battle had only just begun. When the house finally grew quiet again, I sank into Margaret's chair by the window, the one where she used to sit and grade her papers at night. My body felt heavy, but my mind refused to rest. The way Daniel had spoken, so certain, so entitled, echoed through me. I closed my eyes, and memories came not as comfort, but as sharp reminders of what we had given him. I saw myself in uniform, 22 years old, kissing Margaret goodbye on the train platform before shipping out. She clung to me, whispering that she would wait no matter how long. Months later, when the sea tossed our ship and I thought I might not see home again, her letters were what kept me steady. After the Navy, I traded the roar of engines for the steady rhythm of footsteps on sidewalks. Rain or snow, I carried mail through every street in Columbus, knowing the paycheck would feed our children. Margaret worked just as hard. She taught in classrooms that were too full, patched together supplies when the school budget ran thin, and still came home to cook clean and make sure Daniel and Emily felt cared for. She stretched every dollar until it screamed. At night, she saved her coins in a glass jar, telling me it was for Daniel's future textbooks. I remembered the day he got into Ohio State. Margaret cried with joy, and I promised him I would cover the tuition no matter what it took. I picked up extra shifts at the post office, delivered mail on holidays when most men were at home with their families. Margaret sewed clothes for neighbors to bring in a little more. We did it because he was our son, and we believed he would carry our values forward. Instead, I stood in this house listening to him talk about market value and Florida property, like our lives were just numbers in a ledger. The ache of betrayal cut deeper with every memory. I got up and walked through the hall, stopping at the photographs on the wall. Daniel in his Little League uniform, missing his front tooth, smiling at the camera. Margaret had framed it proudly. Another of his high school graduation, his arms slung around my shoulders, his smile wide with promise. I pressed my hand against the glass, wondering when that boy had vanished. The front door creaked open, and Emily stepped inside. She carried a stack of papers and set them on the kitchen counter. Jacob had printed out everything we need for the arrangements, she said. She looked at me closely. Did he come back? I nodded. He wanted the house. Her lips tightened. Of course he did. We sat at the table and she pushed one of the papers toward me. This is the breakdown of costs. Do not worry about it, Dad. Jacob and I will help cover what you cannot. I shook my head. Your mother deserves the best, and I can handle it. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I know you can. Her strength reminded me of Margaret. Same fire in her eyes, same stubborn will. It gave me a flicker of hope that maybe all we had poured into our children had not been wasted, not entirely. That night alone in my room, I pulled an old box from under the bed. Inside were letters Margaret had kept. Bills we had paid off one by one. The deed to the house folded carefully in an envelope. I spread them out across the quilt and let the weight of our life together sink in. This house was more than wood and brick. It was every sacrifice made, every dream protected. No signature of mine would ever give it away. Sleep came in restless bursts. I dreamed of Margaret calling me from the porch, her voice carried by the wind, telling me to stand firm. When morning light crept through the curtains, I felt steadier. The battle with Daniel would not break me. I brewed a pot of coffee and sat with the newspaper, but the words blurred together. My mind wandered back to a night long ago when Daniel was 12 and wanted a new baseball glove. Money was tight, but Margaret and I found a way. He played that whole season with pride, and we thought we were building his character. Now I wondered if we had only taught him that whatever he asked for would be handed over. The phone rang mid-morning. It was Pastor Williams from St. Peter's. He offered condolences, his voice heavy with sincerity, and asked about the service. I told him Emily and Jacob were helping with details that Margaret's favorite hymn would be sung. He promised the church would be ready. When I hung up, I felt a small measure of peace, knowing at least there were still people who remembered dignity. By afternoon, Emily returned with Sophie, her 12-year-old. The little girl's eyes were wide and unsure as she stepped into the house. She hugged me tightly and whispered that she missed Grandma. I held her and whispered back that Grandma loved her more than anything. Seeing her reminded me of why the fight mattered. The house, the legacy, it was not for Daniel. It was for Sophie and whatever came after her. As the evening set in, the house filled with a murmur of preparations. Emily at the table with lists, Jacob on the phone with the funeral home, Sophie drawing quietly in the corner. I walked through it all, feeling the layers of my life pressed together. Past and present sorrow and determination. When the calls quieted and the house settled, I found myself back in Margaret's chair, the same box of papers at my feet. I pulled out the deed again, tracing the lines of my name and hers. The promise I had made beside her bed was alive in that paper. I whispered to her picture on the mantel. They will not take this from us. The snow outside thickened, blanketing the street, muffling the world beyond our walls. Inside the house glowed with lamplight and memory. I sat in silence, holding the papers close, readying myself for what I knew was coming next. The next morning, the phone buzzed on the counter while I was rinsing out my coffee cup. I almost ignored it, but the screen lit up with Olivia's name. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. A minute later, another message came through, this time a voice recording. Against my better judgment, I pressed play. Her voice was sharp, impatient, not meant for me at all. She was talking to someone else, probably a friend. "He will fold," she said. "He is too tired, too old. Just smile, keep pushing, and he will sign." The words landed heavy. My hands gripped the counter until my knuckles ached. They were already counting on my weakness, as if my age had stolen every ounce of strength I had left. I left the phone where it was and stepped outside into the cold. The air bit against my cheeks, the snow creaked under my boots. I walked the length of the yard past the oak tree Margaret loved, the one where she hung bird feeders every spring. I touched the rough bark and closed my eyes. I whispered that I was not finished yet. That afternoon, Daniel came by. He did not knock long before letting himself in, his tone already brisk. "Dad, we need to finalize things." He dropped a folder on the kitchen table, papers sliding out across the wood. Olivia stood behind him, her arms crossed. He opened the folder and pointed at a page. "This is the agreement. You sign here. We sell the house and everything moves forward smoothly." Emily was in the living room with Sophie, but she heard the voices and stormed in. "What are you doing, Daniel?" He barely glanced at her. "Handling business." She picked up one of the papers and read, her eyes widening. "This is ridiculous. You are trying to take everything." Daniel reached for the paper, but she pulled it back. He snapped, his voice sharp. "You do not understand. This is bigger than you. I need this deal to close." I stepped between them. Why is it so urgent, Daniel?" For the first time, his eyes flickered, a shadow crossing his face. He hesitated before answering. "Investments," he said flatly. "I have money tied up. If I do not cover it soon, I could lose everything." Olivia jumped in quickly. "It is just temporary. Once we sell everything, we'll be stable." Emily's voice cracked with disbelief. "So you would sacrifice Dad's home, Mom's memory, just to cover your mistakes?" Daniel's face flushed and he turned on her. "You always play the righteous one, but you have no idea what it means to carry real responsibility." I raised my hand. "Enough." My voice came out low but firm, the same tone I used when commanding young sailors decades ago. I looked straight at him. "This house is not yours to gamble with. Your mother and I built this from nothing." His jaw tightened, his hands balled into fists at his sides. For a moment I thought he might explode, but instead he forced a thin smile. "We will talk again, Dad. You will see reason." He gathered the papers, Olivia clutching his arm as they left. The door shut behind them, the sound echoing through the house. Emily dropped into a chair, tears brimming in her eyes. "He is drowning, Dad. He made some bad choices and now he wants to drag us all down with him." I sat beside her, my chest heavy. "I know, but he is my son." She shook her head. "And I am your daughter, and I will not let him erase everything Mom stood for." Her words cut deep, not because they hurt, but because they were true. I put my hand over hers. "Neither will I." That night I could not sleep. I lay awake listening to the wind rattle the windows, thinking about every shift I had worked at the post office, every dollar Margaret had saved in that glass jar, every promise we made to each other. They thought I would just fold. They thought my silence was weakness. They did not know that silence could be the sharpest weapon of all. Sometime after midnight, I rose from bed and walked to the living room. The photo of Margaret on the mantel caught the glow of the streetlight outside. I stood there for a long while, her eyes on me, steady and kind. I whispered to her picture that I would not break. Not for Daniel. Not for anyone. Then I folded the deed and the trust papers, carefully slid them back into the box, and placed it under my arm. I was done waiting for them to strike. It was time to prepare for the fight they thought I was too weak to win. The next morning, I carried the box of documents into Jacob's office downtown. The walls smelled faintly of old books and fresh coffee, and the steady hum of a heater filled the silence. Jacob greeted me with a firm handshake and motioned me to sit across from his desk. I placed the box between us and slid it forward. He opened it carefully, lifting the deed, the trust papers, and the folder Margaret and I had signed back in 2018. He adjusted his glasses and read for a long while, the scratch of his pen making notes on a yellow pad. Finally, he looked up. "Richard, you and Margaret set this up smart. The trust is airtight. Daniel has no legal claim, and Olivia has even less." The words gave me a calm I had not felt in days. But Jacob was not finished. He tapped the papers with his pen. "If Daniel pushes, and I think he will, he might try intimidation or even attempt a lawsuit. It will not stand, but it could get messy. Are you ready for that?" I thought of Margaret's pale face in the hospital, of her hand in mine, of the promises I whispered to her. "I am ready," I said, my voice steady. Jacob leaned back in his chair. "Then let him make the first move. We will be prepared." Leaving his office, I felt the cold January wind on my face. Instead of weakening me, it braced me, reminded me of the nights I marched in uniform, shoulders squared against storms. The battle had shifted. This was no longer about money. It was about honor, memory, and the kind of legacy Margaret deserved. That evening, Emily came by with Sophie. She found me in the living room, sorting through old photo albums. "Dad, you do not have to do this alone," she said. "Jacob told me everything." I smiled at her, tired but firm. "I know. But this is something your mother and I set in motion a long time ago." Sophie climbed onto the couch beside me, holding one of the photos. "Grandma looks so happy here." Her little voice cracked something in me, but I forced a smile. "She was happy, sweetheart. And she wanted you to have a future safe from people who would take advantage." Sophie did not fully understand, but she nodded and hugged me tight. Later that night, after Emily and Sophie left, the house grew quiet again. I sat in Margaret's chair, the trust papers neatly stacked on the table beside me. My phone buzzed and I saw Daniel's name flashing on the screen. I let it ring out. Moments later, a text appeared. "You cannot fight me, Dad. Sign the papers before it gets ugly." I stared at the message, my jaw clenched. He still believed he could bend me like he had all his life. But he did not know that the fight had already begun on my terms. The following morning, I met Pastor Williams at the church to finalize the funeral service. The sanctuary smelled of old wood and candle wax. The pastor clasped my hand warmly. "Richard, I heard Daniel might be causing trouble." I nodded but said little. He studied me for a moment, then added, "Your wife was a woman of grace. The way you honor her now will echo longer than any argument." His words settled in me like a stone, grounding me. This was not just a legal fight. It was spiritual. It was about what Margaret would have wanted remembered. Back home, I sat at the kitchen table, pen in hand, writing notes for the eulogy. Between each line, my mind wandered back to Daniel's message. He was circling, waiting for me to falter. But I had lived long enough to know that silence and patience could be sharper than any blade. As the day ended, I placed the papers back into the box and locked it in the cabinet Margaret once used for her school files. I touched the key in my pocket, a small piece of metal, but heavy with meaning. The snow outside thickened, covering the driveway, muting the world in white. Inside, the house glowed, warm with lamplight. I breathed deeply, steadying myself. Daniel thought I would fold. He thought age meant weakness. But the truth was, I had never been stronger, because every step I took now carried Margaret's spirit with me. I closed the cabinet, turned off the lights, and let the silence of the house wrap around me, certain that the storm was about to break. The church bells tolled softly as the mourners gathered under the gray January sky. Snow crunched beneath heavy boots, and the cold air carried the low hum of voices into the sanctuary of St. Peter's. I stood near the front, the weight of Margaret's absence pressing harder with each step of the procession. Her photograph, framed with lilies and roses, sat on a stand near the pulpit, her smile frozen in time. Emily stood beside me, her hand hooked around my arm, steadying me as much as herself. Sophie clutched her mother's coat, her eyes wide and unsure. Jacob moved among the ushers, helping guide people to their seats, his voice calm and professional. The pews filled quickly with family friends, neighbors, and old colleagues from the post office. Pastor Williams greeted each one warmly before returning to his place near the altar. The organ began its low, solemn notes, and for a moment the world outside felt far away. Then I saw him. Daniel strode down the center aisle, Olivia at his side, in a dark dress and heels that clicked against the stone floor. His head was held high, his smile too sharp for a day like this. Whispers rippled through the congregation as he guided Olivia to the front pew, directly across from Emily and me. He shook a few hands, even chuckled softly, as if the service was a networking event. My chest tightened, but I said nothing. I had been waiting for this. The pastor opened with prayer, his voice deep and steady. He spoke of Margaret's years of service to her students, of her laughter, of her unshakable faith. As the words washed over me, I closed my eyes and let the memory of her voice fill the silence in my heart. When it came time for family to speak, Emily rose first. She stepped to the pulpit and spoke of her mother's patience, her love of teaching, the way she made every holiday magical. Her voice broke once, but she steadied herself, lifting her chin as if Margaret's spirit held her. People in the pews nodded, some wiping tears. When Emily finished, Daniel stood abruptly. Olivia touched his arm as if to caution him, but he brushed her hand away and walked forward. He took his place at the pulpit, adjusting the microphone. His tone was confident, rehearsed. "Our mother was a strong woman," he said, glancing at the crowd, "and she always wanted what was best for this family. Now that she is gone, it is up to me to carry that vision forward." He paused for effect, his eyes sweeping the room. "That means making decisions that are not always easy. We will be managing the estate with care, ensuring everything is in capable hands." Gasps and murmurs spread through the sanctuary. Emily stiffened beside me, her knuckles white around the edge of the pew. I rose slowly, my body steady though my heart thundered. I walked to the front, each step measured, the silence deepening as I passed down the aisle. When I reached the pulpit, Daniel stepped aside reluctantly, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. I placed my hands on the wood, looking first at Margaret's photo, then out at the faces gathered. "Our family has suffered a great loss." I began, my voice rough but firm. "And my son is right about one thing. Margaret did always want what was best for this family. But what she wanted most was respect, dignity, and love." I reached into my coat and withdrew the envelope Jacob had prepared. Inside were the trust documents signed and sealed years before. I held them up so the congregation could see. Margaret and I made sure her wishes would be honored. This home, this life we built, will not be sold off for someone else's gain. It is already secured in trust for Emily, for Sophie, and for the community Margaret cherished. The room fell silent, then a wave of whispers swept through. Daniel's face flushed, his jaw tight. Olivia's eyes darted, her confidence slipping. I turned to face my son. This is not about money. This is about honoring the woman who gave us everything. He stepped forward, his voice sharp, low enough that only those nearest could hear. You had no right. I met his gaze without blinking. I had every right. And so did she. Pastor Williams cleared his throat gently, steadying the congregation. He spoke a prayer over Margaret's memory, but I barely heard. My eyes were locked on Daniel, who stood rigid, his hands clenched at his sides. As the choir began a hymn, I stepped back from the pulpit, returning to my seat beside Emily. She gripped my hand, her eyes shining with pride and tears. Sophie leaned against her, whispering that Grandma would be happy. Across the aisle, Daniel sat stone-faced, his leg bouncing with restrained fury. Olivia leaned close, whispering something into his ear. He shook his head violently, his face red. I looked once more at Margaret's photo, her smile steady and serene. For the first time since the hospital, I felt the faintest lift in my chest, as if she were whispering that I had done exactly what she hoped I would. The hymn swelled, filling the sanctuary with voices. And while the crowd sang of peace, I knew the real storm was only beginning. When the service ended, and the last mourners drifted out into the cold, I stayed seated in the front pew. The church felt hollow, without the swell of voices, the air heavy with candle smoke and sorrow. Emily squeezed my shoulder before stepping outside with Jacob and Sophie. I told them I would follow in a minute. The sound of sharp footsteps echoed down the aisle. Daniel stopped in front of me, his face tight. Olivia stepped behind him. He leaned down so no one else could hear. You humiliated me, Dad. Right in front of everyone. I lifted my eyes slowly, meeting his glare. I told the truth. That is not humiliation. That is honor. His jaw clenched. You think you can just shut me out with a piece of paper. You do not know what you have started. Olivia tugged his arm, whispering for him to calm down, but he jerked away. I rose, my knees stiff, but my voice steady. What I started was protecting your mother's name, something you should have cared about more than property. For a moment he said nothing, his breath visible in the cold air seeping through the church doors. Then he laughed, short and bitter. You are going to regret this. He turned sharply and stormed out, Olivia trailing after him with a nervous glance in my direction. Outside, the snow fell in thick sheets, muffling the sounds of cars along the street. Emily came to my side, concern etched across her face. What did he say? I shook my head. Nothing worth repeating. Back at the house that evening, the living room was filled with relatives bringing casseroles and offering soft condolences. Margaret's photograph sat on the mantel, the candles flickering. I thanked each visitor as best I could, though my mind was still replaying Daniel's words. When the last guest left, and the house grew quiet again, Robert, my older brother, lingered by the doorway. He had always been a reserved man, but tonight his eyes were sharp. Richard, I heard the way Daniel spoke today. You need to be careful. He is desperate. I poured us both coffee in the kitchen, the clock ticking on the wall. Robert set his cup down and leaned forward. I know what it is like when money blinds a man. Years ago, I nearly lost everything chasing deals. Do not underestimate him. I nodded slowly, the truth of it settling heavy in my chest. Robert continued. If you need me to stand with you, I will. Family should mean something, even if Daniel has forgotten that. His words caught me off guard. We had our share of disagreements over the years, but tonight I saw sincerity in his eyes. I thanked him, and for the first time in a long while, I felt I was not carrying the weight alone. Later that night, after Robert left, I stepped into the quiet bedroom. Margaret's pillow still held the faintest scent of her lavender soap. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the dark window. The snow outside glowed faintly in the streetlight, soft and relentless. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from an unknown number appeared. Better sign before it is too late. My stomach tightened, but I did not reply. The next day, rumors began to spread among relatives and neighbors. One neighbor stopped me on the porch and asked if it was true Daniel was taking over the estate. I shook my head firmly. No. The matter is settled. But the whispers revealed how quickly Daniel was trying to twist the story. By afternoon, Emily returned with Jacob, their faces grave. Jacob laid a folder on the table. He has already spoken with a lawyer in Cleveland, Dad. He's going to try to challenge the trust. I sat back in the chair, feeling the years in my bones, but my resolve only hardened. Let him try. Emily's eyes welled with tears. I am scared for you. He is not the same brother I grew up with. I reached for her hand. I am not afraid of him. I have fought bigger battles. The evening fell quiet again, but the silence was thick with tension. I lit one of Margaret's candles and placed it beside her photo. The flame wavered in the draft, steadying after a moment. I whispered into the stillness that I would not falter, even as Daniel circled like a storm outside these walls. The fight was coming, and I was ready to meet it head-on. The letter arrived 2 days later in a thick white envelope stamped from a Cleveland law office. I sat at the kitchen table, turning it over in my hands before sliding a knife under the flap. Inside was the notice I had expected. Daniel was petitioning to challenge the trust, claiming undue influence and lack of capacity when it was signed. My name stared back at me in black ink, each word sharp as a blade. I laid the papers flat, breathing slow. The coffee on the stove hissed, forgotten until Emily rushed in and caught sight of my face. What is it, Dad? I slid the notice toward her. She skimmed the words, her jaw tightening. He is really doing this. Jacob arrived that evening, his briefcase heavy with documents. He read the letter carefully, then leaned back in his chair. It will not hold, he said. You and Margaret were of sound mind in 2018. The witnesses are solid. But this will drag you through hearings. Daniel is hoping the pressure will make you fold. I felt a strange calm settle over me. He is wrong. Margaret and I prepared for this. Jacob nodded. Good. Then we will stand firm. The first hearing came quickly. I sat in the wood-paneled courtroom, the American flag draped behind the judge, the air dry with the scent of old books and polished wood. Daniel sat across the aisle, his suit sharp Olivia at his side. He did not look at me once. His lawyer spoke with confidence, painting a picture of an old man swayed by his daughter and son-in-law, pressured into locking away what should have gone to his rightful heir. When Jacob rose, his voice was measured and strong. He presented the signed documents, the witnesses, the notarized seals. He reminded the court of Margaret's long career as a teacher, her clear mind, her careful planning. He told the story not of pressure, but of prudence. I watched Daniel's jaw twitch as Jacob spoke. For the first time, I saw doubt flash in his eyes. The judge adjourned without ruling, setting another date. As we filed out, Daniel brushed past me, his shoulder hitting mine. This is not over, he muttered. Back at the house that night, the quiet felt different. Emily made tea, setting the mug in front of me, her hands trembling. Dad, how can he hate us this much? I stared at the steam rising from the cup. It is not hate. It is greed. And greed blinds a man to everything else. The days turned into weeks. Gossip spread through the neighborhood and at church. Some people avoided eye contact, unsure of what to believe. Others offered quiet support, slipping notes into my hand after Sunday service. Stay strong, Richard. Margaret would be proud. One afternoon, as I shoveled snow from the walkway, Robert pulled up in his old truck. He climbed out slowly, his breath clouding in the cold. "Heard he is stirring things again," he said. I nodded. Robert leaned on the shovel beside me. If he pushes too far, the community will see him for what he is. They already whisper about his debts in Cleveland. His words struck me. Debts. Investments gone wrong. That was why Daniel was so desperate. He was not fighting for legacy. He was fighting for survival. The second hearing came, and this time Pastor Williams appeared as a witness. He spoke of Margaret's clarity of mind, of conversations they had in 2018 about her plans for the trust. His words carried weight not just legal, but moral. I sat straighter as he spoke, the memory of Margaret's soft laugh filling me. Daniel's lawyer faltered, shuffling papers, trying to poke holes that were not there. Daniel's face reddened, his fists clenched on the table. Olivia avoided looking at anyone, her eyes fixed on the floor. When it ended, Jacob leaned close. He knows he is losing. He will lash out. That night my phone buzzed with another message. "You will regret this. Sign before it is too late." I stared at the screen until the letters blurred, then set the phone down. My hands did not shake. The following Sunday, the community gathered for a meal after service. I sat at a long table with Emily and Sophie, the hum of conversation around us. Suddenly, Daniel appeared at the doorway. The room hushed. He walked straight to our table, his voice louder than it should have been. "You are tearing this family apart, Dad." I stood slowly, every eye in the room on us. "No, Daniel. I am holding this family together. It is you who is tearing it apart." Gasps rippled through the hall. Robert stood from across the room and stepped forward. "Richard is right. You shame this family with your greed." The room erupted in murmurs, some nodding, some whispering. Daniel's face twisted with rage. He turned sharply and stormed out, Olivia scrambling to follow. When the door slammed behind him, the silence returned heavy and thick. Emily touched my arm, her eyes wide with fear and sorrow. I lowered myself back into the chair, my heart pounding, my breath heavy. The fight was not finished, but the tide had shifted. The world had seen his true face, and there was no turning back. The snow had melted by the time the judge delivered his final ruling. I sat in the quiet courtroom, the wood paneling gleaming in the afternoon light, Emily on one side of me and Jacob on the other. The judge's voice was clear and steady as he confirmed what I already knew in my bones. The trust was valid. Margaret's wishes stood. There would be no sale, no signatures, no surrender. Daniel's lawyer shuffled his papers and avoided looking at him. Across the aisle, Daniel sat rigid, his face pale, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought he might break his teeth. Olivia leaned away from him, her eyes darting to the door as if she could escape the shame that filled the room. When the gavel struck, the sound echoed like a final nail, sealing the coffin of his schemes. Emily gripped my hand, tears streaming down her face. Sophie, who had been allowed to sit quietly in the back, rushed forward and hugged me. "We did it, Grandpa," she whispered. My chest swelled with something I had not felt in weeks. Relief. Outside the courthouse, the air smelled faintly of thawing earth, the first hints of spring breaking through the cold. Reporters lingered on the steps, whispering about the family dispute that had spilled into public view. Daniel stormed past them without a word, Olivia trailing behind, with her head down. I watched them disappear into the street, two shadows shrinking into the distance. Back home, the house felt lighter. The silence that once weighed like stone now felt like peace. Margaret's photo still sat on the mantel. The candles burned low, but the heaviness around it had lifted. I sat in her chair by the window and let the sunlight spill across my hands. For the first time since that night in the hospital, I could breathe without the ache of dread. Emily joined me later that evening with Sophie, who carried a small plate of cookies she had baked herself. We sat at the table, laughter slipping between us like it used to when Margaret was alive. For a moment, I could almost hear her humming in the kitchen, the sound of a pan clattering on the stove. I held that memory gently, not as a wound, but as a gift. Robert stopped by the next day, bringing a thermos of hot coffee and a quiet smile. "You did good, little brother," he said. "You honored her the way she deserved." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. He sat with me for an hour, two old men sharing silence, both knowing that sometimes silence carried more meaning than words ever could. Life settled into a new rhythm. The house was still too large for one man, but I no longer felt alone in it. Emily visited often. Sophie filled the rooms with her drawings and chatter. Jacob kept an eye on the paperwork. The community that had once whispered now greeted me warmly. Their eyes filled with respect. They had seen me stand firm, and in some way they carried that with them too. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the snow in gold, I walked out to the cemetery. The ground was damp under my boots, the wind sharp but clean. I found Margaret's stone, the flowers Emily had left still fresh, their colors bright against the gray. I knelt slowly, my knees stiff, and placed my hand against the cold granite. I told her everything. How Daniel had fought and failed, how Emily had stood strong, how Sophie had given me hope when the nights felt darkest. I told her I had kept my promise, that no one had stripped her memory or our life's work away. The wind carried through the trees, and for a moment I swore I felt her hand in mine again, light but steady. As I rose to leave, I looked back once more. The stone stood firm against the fading light, just as I had stood firm against the storm. At home that night, I sat in the living room, with Sophie curled up beside me, Emily flipping through a photo album across the table. Laughter bubbled as we pointed out old pictures, remembering stories long buried but never lost. I felt Margaret with us, not in body, but in every smile, every memory, every moment of love we still carried. I realized then that the house was not just wood and brick. It was a vessel for everything we had built, and it would stand not because of my stubbornness, but because love deserved a place to live. So I held my granddaughter's hand and whispered to myself that silence had been my weapon, patience, my shield, and memory, my victory. Daniel had lost more than a case. He had lost his family, his standing, his honor. What I had left was far greater. If you have ever fought to protect what truly matters, you know the cost and the reward. Tell me, have you ever faced betrayal within your own family and found strength in a promise kept? Share your thoughts with me. Your stories keep this channel alive, and I would be honored to hear them.